Blood tastes exactly like rusted copper pennies. That was my only coherent thought when my stepfather shoved me onto the rain-slicked pavement at the feet of a man the entire city whispered about in the dark. They traded my life for $50,000 and a clean slate at the underground tables. I was supposed to be a corpse by morning, a disposable plaything for a monster. But monsters don't always wear fangs. Sometimes, the only way to survive the dark is to rule it. Rain soaked through the thin soles of my canvas sneakers, chilling my toes to the bone. I stood in the alleyway behind a dilapidated strip mall, the neon sign from a failing liquor store casting sickly pink shadows across the wet asphalt. The smell of rotting garbage and cheap gin clung to everything. "Stand up straight, Ethan. Stop looking so pathetic." Derek's voice was a harsh hiss, barely carrying over the sound of the downpour. My stepfather smelled of cheap cologne and nervous sweat. His fingers dug into my bicep, his acrylic nails, sharper than they had any right to be, leaving crescent moon bruises through my damp sweater. Next to him, my stepbrother Cole was furiously texting on his phone, pretending this wasn't happening. Cole's designer boots, bought with the last of my father's life insurance money, splashed in a puddle as he shifted his weight. I didn't scream. Screaming requires energy, and I had been running on empty for 3 years, since my father's heart gave out. I had been the maid, the punching bag, and the primary source of income for these two parasites. Now I was currency. Headlights cut through the rain, blinding us. A black SUV rolled to a stop, its heavy tires crunching over broken glass and wet gravel. The engine idled with a low, predatory hum. Cole finally looked up from his screen, his jaw tightening. Derek's grip on my arm became agonizing. A man stepped out of the driver's side. He wasn't the monster, just a guy in a tailored suit that probably cost more than my entire miserable existence. He opened an umbrella, walked around the back of the SUV, and opened the rear door. Gabriel Costa stepped onto the pavement. He didn't look like the boogeyman the local news made him out to be. There were no horns, no maniacal grin. Just a tall, broad-shouldered alpha in a dark wool overcoat. His hair was damp, sticking to his forehead, and he looked profoundly exhausted. Under the pink neon light, his eyes were the color of slate, flat, dead, and entirely uninterested in me. "Mr. Costa?" Derek simpered, the sheer desperation in his voice making my stomach turn. "I brought him, just like we agreed." Gabriel didn't look at Derek. He looked at me. His gaze traced the line of my jaw, dropping to the frayed cuffs of my oversized sweater, then to my soaked, trembling knees. There was no lust in his eyes, no pity either. It was the look of a man evaluating a used piece of machinery. "This is the collateral?" His voice was gravel and smoke, rough around the edges, vibrating in the damp air. "Yes," Derek said, practically vibrating with eager cruelty. "He's a hard worker, doesn't complain much. He'll do whatever you need. The debt is clear, right?" The suited man beside Gabriel pulled a thick manila envelope from his jacket and tossed it onto the wet pavement at Derek's feet. "Your markers," the suited man said. "Don't come back to the Golden Room. Next time we don't take trade-ins." Derek snatched the envelope off the wet ground, not caring that his knees dragged in a puddle of oily water. Cole grabbed his father's shoulder, pulling him back. They didn't even look at me. No goodbye, no apology. They just backed away into the shadows, leaving me standing alone in the rain. Gabriel nodded toward the open door of the SUV. "Get in." I looked down at my hands. They were shaking, raw and red from the cold. I could run. I knew these alleyways. But my boots were waterlogged, my lungs ached, and I had exactly $0 to my name. Survival instinct is a luxury for the rested and the funded. I was neither. I walked toward the car. The leather interior smelled of expensive vetiver, stale cigarette smoke, and the sharp tang of gun oil. I slid into the back seat, sinking into the plush upholstery. It was warm. I pulled my knees to my chest, wrapping my arms around my legs, trying to stop the shivering. Gabriel got in beside me. The door slammed shut, cutting off the sound of the rain. The silence inside the cabin was sudden and heavy. The driver put the car in gear, and we rolled away from the alley, away from the only miserable life I had ever known. "You're dripping on the leather," Gabriel said softly. I stared straight ahead at the back of the driver's headrest. "Sorry," I rasped, my throat feeling like sandpaper. "You can bill my stepfather for the cleaning." I heard a slow, measured exhale beside me. It wasn't a laugh, but it was close. "There's a towel in the compartment by your feet. Dry your hair." I reached down, my stiff fingers fumbling with the latch, and pulled out a thick black microfiber towel. I pressed it to my face, inhaling the smell of clean cotton. For the first time that night, I closed my eyes. I was entirely at the mercy of a cartel boss, a man who allegedly gutted his rivals and left them in shipping containers. Yet, as the heater blasted over my freezing skin, I felt something terrifyingly close to relief. Chapter 2. The Estate. The Costa Estate wasn't a dungeon. It was a fortress disguised as a mid-century modern architectural marvel, nestled into a cliffside overlooking the churning black waters of the bay. When we arrived, Gabriel didn't drag me by the hair or throw me into a basement. He simply walked through the massive glass front doors, threw his keys onto a marble console table, and pointed down a long hallway. "Third door on the left. Stay out of the east wing. Breakfast is at 7. Don't touch the thermostat." He was already shrugging off his wet overcoat. I stood in the foyer, dripping onto the pristine hardwood floor. "That's it?" I asked, the words tumbling out before my brain could catch them. Gabriel paused, half turned toward me, his heavy brow furrowed. "Were you expecting a tour? It's late. Go to sleep." I was expecting. I swallowed hard, the reality of my situation finally clawing at the back of my throat. I was expecting to be locked in a cage. Or worse. He looked at me for a long, uncomfortable moment. The silence in the house was absolute. No ticking clocks, no hum of a refrigerator, just the distant, muffled crash of waves against the rocks below. "Your stepfather owed me 50,000, Gabriel said, his tone conversational, as if we were discussing the price of groceries. "He spent it on rigged baccarat games and cheap gin." "I don't run a brothel, Ethan. I run a business. You are here because he needed to lose something that hurt, and he convinced himself you were valuable. Judging by the way he left you in the dirt, I'm guessing you aren't." The words felt like a slap, not because they were cruel, but because they were true. "So why take me?" I challenged, my voice shaking. "If I have no value, why agree to the trade?" "Because," he said, turning fully toward me, a flat deadness in his eyes shifting into something colder, sharper. "He thinks I'm going to tear you apart. He thinks he sacrificed you to the devil to save his own skin. Let him live with that ghost. It's better leverage than cash." He walked away, his heavy footsteps fading down a different corridor, leaving me entirely alone in a house that smelled of lemon polish and old secrets. I found the room he mentioned. It was large, sterile, and perfectly clean. The walls were painted a soft muted gray. There was a king-sized bed with white linens, a massive en-suite bathroom, and a closet filled with neutral-toned, practical clothing in my exact size: sweaters, jeans, soft cotton shirts. I locked the door, though the click of the lock felt absurd in a house owned by a mob boss. I stripped off my wet, filthy clothes, leaving them in a pathetic heap on the floor, and stepped into the shower. The water was blisteringly hot. I stood under the spray until my skin turned red, scrubbing at my arms and legs with a bar of unscented soap until the smell of the alley, of Derek's cheap cologne, of the dirty rain, was gone. When I finally crawled into the bed, the mattress yielded beneath me. Memory foam. It was the most comfortable thing I had ever felt. I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the panic to set in. I was a prisoner. I was collateral. I was owned by a murderer. But I didn't have to cook breakfast for Derek tomorrow. I didn't have to scrub Cole's vomit out of the rug after his benders. I didn't have to work a double shift at the diner just to watch my paycheck disappear into Derek's wallet. I closed my eyes. The irony tasted bitter on my tongue. The safest I had felt in years was in the bed of a monster. Chapter 3. The Routine. The next few weeks fell into a bizarre, suffocating routine. I was a ghost haunting a beautiful machine. There were guards, of course, alphas in suits who stood at the perimeter of the property. One of them, a younger guy named Leo with a scar bisecting his left eyebrow, brought my meals if I didn't want to go to the kitchen. He never spoke, just nodded and left the tray. Gabriel was a phantom. I saw him mostly in the mornings. I would walk into the kitchen, sunlight glaring off the granite countertops, and he would be sitting at the island, drinking black coffee and scrolling through a tablet. We rarely spoke. The silence between us wasn't comfortable, but it wasn't threatening either. It was just heavy, an acknowledgement of a transaction that neither of us entirely knew how to process. One evening, he was sitting at the massive dining table, a plate of half-eaten steak in front of him. I walked in to grab a glass of water, intending to retreat to my room. "Sit," he commanded, not looking up. I froze, the glass cold against my palm. I pulled out a chair at the far end of the table, 10 feet away from him. "The food here is good," he said, cutting into a piece of asparagus. "But you're losing weight. The clothes my people bought are hanging off your shoulders." "I eat," I replied defensively, staring at the grain of the wood table. "You eat like a stray dog expecting to be kicked away from the bowl," he countered smoothly. He set his fork down, the silver clinking sharply against the porcelain plate. "I told you, Ethan, I don't torture people. You can stop bracing for the blow." "I'm not bracing for anything," I lied. Gabriel leaned back in his chair, studying me. The overhead lights caught the subtle silver threads at his temples. "You sleep with your back to the wall. You flinch when Leo opens a door too fast. And you hold your breath every time I walk into a room." My nails dug into my palms. I was sold for 50 grand by my own family. Forgive me if my trust issues are acting up. A muscle feathered in his jaw. He didn't offer a platitude. He didn't tell me it was going to be okay. 50 grand is nothing, he said coldly. It's a rounding error. You aren't here because of the money, Ethan. You're here because you are discarded, and I collect things people throw away. Why? I asked, looking him dead in the eye for the first time. Do you enjoy looking at the wreckage? He held my gaze, his slate eyes unreadable. No, I enjoy knowing exactly what things are worth, especially when everyone else gets it wrong. He stood up, abandoning his dinner, and walked out of the room. I sat alone at the massive table, the silence pressing in on my ears, my heart hammering against my ribs. Chapter 4. The Wound. The illusion of peace shattered on a Tuesday. It was raining again. The coastal storms here were violent, lashing against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the estate like angry fists. I was sitting in the massive, dimly lit library, curled up in a leather armchair with a book I wasn't really reading. The smell of old paper and dust hung in the air, a dry contrast to the wet chaos outside. Just past midnight, the front door slammed open. I jolted, the book slipping from my lap. The heavy thud of boots echoing in the foyer wasn't rhythmic or measured. It was clumsy, stumbling. I crept out of the library, pressing my back against the cool plaster of the hallway wall. From my vantage point, I could see the entryway. Gabriel was leaning heavily against the marble console table. His dark overcoat was soaked, but it wasn't just rain. In the harsh, bright light of the chandelier, the wet sheen on his left side was unmistakably crimson. He was gasping, short, sharp intakes of breath that rattled in his chest. Leo was beside him, looking panicked, pressing a wad of cloth against Gabriel's ribs. "Boss, we need to call the doctor. I'm making the call." "No," Gabriel snarled, his voice guttural and thick with pain. He swatted Leo's hand away. No doctors, not for this. The leak came from the inside. If the doc comes here, it flags the system. We handle it. I can't stitch that, Leo protested, his hands smeared with blood. I don't know how deep it is. I should have walked away. I should have gone back to my memory foam bed, locked the door, and let the monsters tear each other apart. If Gabriel bled out on the Italian marble, I would be free. The debt would be void. I could walk out the front door and disappear. But I stood there, watching the blood drip onto the pristine floor, pooling around the soles of his expensive leather shoes. The copper smell hit the air, metallic and sharp, cutting through the lemon polish. Before I could rationalize it, I was stepping into the light. Where is the kit? I asked. Both men snapped their heads toward me. Gabriel's face was pale, a sickening shade of gray, beads of sweat standing out on his forehead. His eyes narrowed, trying to focus on me through the haze of shock. Go back to your room, Ethan, Gabriel gritted out. You're ruining the floor, I said, keeping my voice entirely flat. I looked at Leo. You have a trauma kit here. Where is it? Leo hesitated, glancing at Gabriel then back at me. Under the sink in the downstairs half bath. Black duffel. I walked past them, my bare feet patting softly against the wood. I retrieved the heavy bag, the nylon rough against my skin, and brought it back to the foyer. Sit on the bench, I told Gabriel, pointing to the sturdy oak bench near the door. I'm fine, he growled, attempting to stand straight. His knee buckled instantly. Leo caught him, hauling him over to the bench and practically dropping him onto the wood. Gabriel let out a low curse, his head falling back against the wall. Leo, go watch the perimeter, Gabriel ordered, his breath hitching. If anyone followed us, I want to know before they breach the gate. Leo looked like he wanted to argue, but the murderous glint in Gabriel's half-open eyes stopped him. He nodded, grabbed his sidearm, and disappeared into the rain. I was left alone with the devil. I unzipped the kit, fully stocked, military grade. I pulled out a pair of latex gloves, snapping them onto my wrists. The sound was incredibly loud in the empty foyer. I grabbed trauma shears, betadine, gauze, and a sterile suture pack. Take off the coat, I said. Gabriel didn't move. He just watched me, his chest heaving. You know how to use that? He asked, nodding at the needle in my hand. My father was sick for a long time. I learned how to patch things up when we couldn't afford the ER, I said smoothly. I stepped between his spread knees, leaning over him. Coat now, or I'll cut it off. He let out a breath that sounded like a scoff, but he complied, wincing as he shrugged out of the heavy wool. His white button-down shirt was completely ruined, soaked dark red on the left side. I didn't bother asking him to unbutton it. I took the shears and sliced up the side seam, peeling the wet fabric away from his skin. His torso was corded with muscle, but scattered across the pale skin were a dozen faded scars, burn marks, puncture wounds, a map of a very violent life. The fresh wound was a jagged slice across his lower ribs, a knife, not a bullet. Deep, but it hadn't hit an organ. It's messy, but superficial, I muttered, mostly to myself. I grabbed a bottle of sterile saline and squirted it directly into the wound to flush out the debris. Gabriel's entire body went rigid. His massive hand shot out, wrapping around my wrist like a vice. His skin was clammy and freezing cold, his grip bruising. I didn't flinch. I just looked down at him, my expression bored. If you break my wrist, you're stitching this yourself with your left hand. Let go. His eyes searched my face. He was looking for fear, for panic. He found none. Slowly, his fingers uncurled, dropping away from my arm. You're remarkably calm for someone who was shaking in an alley 3 weeks ago, he whispered, his voice strained as I began swabbing the angry red flesh with betadine. I panic when I don't know what's going to happen, I replied, tearing open the suture packet. I know exactly how to fix a cut. I like things that have logical solutions. And if I died, he asked softly, I paused, holding the curved needle in the forceps. I looked at the pulse beating frantically at the base of his throat, then up to his eyes. I would have taken the cash from the safe in your office, the one behind the abstract painting, by the way, very cliché, and I would have caught a bus to Seattle. A low, rumbling chuckle vibrated in his chest, immediately followed by a wince of pain. You figured out my safe? It's an older biometric model. The optical scanner is coated in a thin film of your finger oils. It wouldn't take much to bypass it. I leaned in. Take a deep breath. This is going to suck. I pushed the needle through his skin. Gabriel hissed, his jaw locking, but he didn't move away. For 20 minutes, the only sounds were the howling wind outside, the wet slide of the thread, and his ragged breathing. I worked methodically, tying off neat, tight knots. I was so close to him I could smell the gunpowder on his skin beneath the metallic stench of the blood. I could feel the heat radiating from his chest. It was the most intimate contact I'd had with another human being in years, and it was entirely clinical. Why didn't you run? He asked suddenly, the silence stretching too thin. I clipped the end of the thread and grabbed a bandage. I just told you, you aren't dead. No, he said, his voice dropping an octave, finding a steady, dangerous rhythm despite the blood loss. In the alley, you didn't fight. You didn't scream. Derek handed you over to a cartel boss, and you just got in the car. I pressed the adhesive bandage firmly against his side, my hands lingering for a fraction of a second too long against his warm skin, before pulling back. I stripped the bloody latex gloves off, tossing them into the trash bag. Because, I said, looking down at my clean, unshaky hands, I was already living with monsters. Derek made me sleep on the floor. He made me skip meals so Cole could buy designer clothes. He hit me when he lost at the track. Getting in your car wasn't a surrender, Gabriel. I looked up, meeting his intense slate gaze. The exhaustion in his face had receded, replaced by a sharp, calculating focus. It was an upgrade. I picked up the trauma kit, turned on my heel, and walked away, leaving him sitting in his own blood on the marble floor. I didn't know it then, but as I walked back to my room, the lock on my gilded cage didn't just open, it dissolved entirely. The shift had happened. I wasn't just surviving him anymore. I was beginning to understand him. And that was vastly more dangerous. Chapter 5, The Books. Morning arrived not with sunlight, but with the abrasive, mechanical grind of the espresso machine in the kitchen. I lay in bed for exactly 10 minutes, listening to the rain continue its assault on the glass. My fingers still smelled faintly of betadine and copper. I rubbed them against the high thread count sheets, trying to scrape the phantom sensation of Gabriel's blood from my skin. When I finally walked down the hall, the house felt fundamentally different. The static charge of imminent violence was gone, replaced by a heavy, bruised exhaustion. Leo was slumped in a leather chair by the front door, nursing a mug of coffee. He had dark circles under his eyes, and his suit jacket was crumpled. He didn't say a word as I passed, but his chin dipped a fraction of an inch, a nod. It wasn't deference exactly, but it was an acknowledgement. I wasn't just a piece of furniture anymore. Gabriel was in his office. The door was ajar, spilling a slice of yellow light onto the hardwood floor. I pushed it open without knocking. He was sitting behind a massive oak desk, shirtless, a fresh white bandage taped securely over his ribs. He looked terrible, skin sallow, dark hair a tangled mess. A glass of amber liquid sat next to a stack of unread files, untouched. He had a black pen in his right hand, staring blankly at a spreadsheet. You're supposed to be resting, I said, my voice sounding loud in the quiet room. He didn't look up immediately. He carefully capped the pen, setting it down with a muted click. Rest is for people who don't have 20 million moving through a port on a Tuesday. Sit down. I took the chair opposite him. The leather was cold. The office smelled of cedarwood, old paper, and the sharp bite of scotch. I checked the safe, he said, his voice a low rasp. The optical scanner was wiped clean. I told you it was a vulnerability, I replied, crossing my legs. If I noticed it while dusting, someone looking for it would find it instantly. He finally lifted his head. His slate eyes were bloodshot, the edges tight with suppressed pain. You dust my office? I get bored. I don't like sitting in a room waiting for someone to tell me I'm allowed to breathe. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees. Derek owed you 50 grand. You said it was a rounding error. But a man who micromanages 20 million on a Tuesday doesn't let 50 grand slide unless he's meticulous about his ledgers. You keep track of every dime. Gabriel studied me. He leaned back in his chair, wincing slightly as the movement pulled at his stitches. My accountant disappeared 3 days ago. He took a significant amount of encrypted data with him. That's why I was bleeding in my foyer last night. I was extracting a name from a low-level associate who thought he could sell me out. My stomach performed a slow, cold roll. Extracting a name. I didn't want to know the mechanics of that. I focused on the practical problem instead. So your books are a mess. They are functionally non-existent, he corrected dryly. And I have shipments that need to be cleared, payoffs that need to be routed, and shell companies that need their quarterly audits fabricated by Friday. I looked at the stack of files on his desk, then back at him. I did the bookkeeping for the diner where I worked. I also managed Derek's debts. I know how to move money around so people don't ask questions. A profound silence stretched between us. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked, a rhythmic, heavy sound. You're offering to cook the books for a crime syndicate? Gabriel said slowly, rolling the words over his tongue as if testing their weight. You realize what that makes you. Useful, I said. It was the truest thing I had ever spoken. In my world, if you weren't useful, you were dead weight. Dead weight got sold in alleyways. Gabriel's lips twitched, a shadow of a grim smile. He pushed the stack of files across the desk. The heavy manila folders slid over the polished wood and stopped right at the edge, inches from my hands. The passwords are in the red notebook, he said, closing his eyes and pressing 2 fingers to the bridge of his nose. Don't mess up the routing numbers. If a wire goes to the wrong account, I have to kill people to get it back, and I'm far too tired for that today. I pulled the files toward me. The paper was rough under my fingertips. It felt like control. Chapter 6. The Dinner. For the next 4 days, the office became my sanctuary. I learned the anatomy of a criminal empire. It wasn't cinematic. It was mostly spreadsheets, tax loopholes, and endless columns of numbers. I sat across from Gabriel for hours. The only sounds the clacking of my laptop keys and the occasional rustle of paper. We existed in a functional, bloodless orbit. He handled the logistics of his violence. I cleaned up the financial residue. I was laundering money. I was complicit. But as I balanced an account that funneled illegal gambling profits into a legitimate real estate holding, my hands didn't shake once. Friday night arrived with the suffocating humidity of an impending storm. The air inside the estate felt thick, charged with the kind of tension that makes the hairs on your arms stand up. Gabriel had summoned his inner circle, a dinner. It was a power play, designed to show his capos that the rumor of him bleeding out in a ditch was entirely exaggerated. He was functional. He was in control. And he wanted me at the table. I'm not a show dog. I told him an hour before the guests arrived. I was standing in his bedroom. He had called me in to help him adjust a shoulder holster over his healing ribs. He was wearing a charcoal suit that fit him like armor. He looked entirely lethal. The exhaustion from earlier in the week replaced by a cold, predatory focus. No, Gabriel agreed, adjusting his cuffs. You're my bookkeeper, and the man who stitched me up. They know you're here. If I hide you in a back room, they'll think you're a weakness. If I put you at my right hand, they'll know you're an asset or a target. I pointed out, pulling the leather strap tied across his back. He grunted softly, but didn't complain. Only if you look like prey, he murmured, turning to face me. He reached out, his large, calloused fingers brushing against the silk collar of the dress shirt he had sent to my room earlier that afternoon. It was deep emerald, simple, tailored, and entirely too expensive. Don't look like prey, Ethan. The dining room was a theater of cruelty disguised as a civilized meal. There were 4 men besides Gabriel. They smelled of expensive cigars, stale sweat, and varying degrees of arrogance. I sat directly to Gabriel's right. The crystal wine glass felt fragile in my grip. A man named Victor, a thick-necked enforcer with a spiderweb tattoo crawling up his throat, spent the first course staring at my chest. Beside him was Dante, Gabriel's alleged second-in-command. Dante was lean, sharp-featured, and possessed a smile that didn't reach his dead black eyes. "So," Dante said, dragging his knife across his steak with unnecessary force. The metal shrieked against the porcelain. "This is the stray you picked up from the Costa Mesa game? I heard he cost you 50 large. Seems steep for a maid." The table went dead silent. The clinking of silverware stopped. Gabriel didn't look at Dante. He calmly lifted his wine glass, taking a slow sip. He was waiting. He was testing me. My heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs, a trapped bird looking for an exit. But I remembered Derek, the men he brought home, ones who spoke to me like I was dirt under their boots. I had survived them by shrinking. I wasn't shrinking tonight. I set my fork down. The click was sharp and authoritative. I looked directly into Dante's eyes. 50,000 is an interesting number for you to scoff at, Dante, I said, my voice eerily calm, low, steady. Especially considering you authorized a payment of 62,000 to a shell company in the Caymans last month for logistical oversight on a shipment that never actually required customs clearance. Dante's sneer vanished. His skin paled rapidly, the blood draining from his face. "I audited the books this week," I continued, picking up my wine glass. I swirled the dark red liquid, watching the legs cling to the glass. That money bypassed the central holding account. It just vanished. It seems to me, if we are discussing steep prices and useless assets, we should start with your accounting practices. Victor choked on a laugh, quickly disguising it as a cough. Dante's hands flattened on the table. "You lying little bitch." Gabriel moved so fast, I didn't even see him shift his weight. 1 second, he was leaning back. The next, his left hand had shot across the table, grabbing Dante by the lapels of his suit and slamming his chest into the wood. Crystal glasses toppled, wine bleeding across the white linen tablecloth like a fresh wound. "Finish that sentence," Gabriel whispered. His voice was a soft, terrifying rasp. "Finish it, Dante, and I will cut your tongue out and feed it to you in front of this table." Dante swallowed hard. A bead of sweat rolled down his temple. He shook his head sharply. "My mistake, boss. Just a misunderstanding." Gabriel held him there for 3 agonizing seconds, letting the fear marinate in the room. Then he shoved Dante backward. Dante scrambled to fix his jacket, his hands trembling. Gabriel picked up his napkin, calmly dabbing a drop of spilled wine from his cuff. "Ethan is not a stray. He is not a maid. He is the reason this organization isn't hemorrhaging cash right now. His word is my word. If he finds a discrepancy, I find a body." "Understood." A chorus of tight, fearful "yes, boss" echoed around the table. For the rest of the meal, no one looked at me. They didn't speak to me. I sat there, the emerald silk clinging to my skin, my pulse finally settling into a steady, powerful rhythm. I looked at Gabriel. He caught my eye. There was no warmth there, no romantic gratitude. It was raw, unadulterated approval. I took a sip of the wine. It tasted like victory. I hated myself for how much I loved the flavor. Chapter 7. The Truth and the Kiss. The house was finally empty by 2 a.m. The rain had returned, a torrential downpour that rattled the heavy window panes. I was standing in the kitchen, barefoot, pouring a glass of cold water. The adrenaline from the dinner had long since crashed. leaving me hollowed out and shivering despite the warmth of the house. I had played the monster's consort. I had wielded his power. I had almost gotten a man killed over a spreadsheet. Footsteps padded softly behind me. I didn't flinch. I knew his heavy, measured tread by now. Gabriel stopped next to me. He had discarded his jacket and tie, the top 3 buttons of his shirt undone. He smelled of scotch and cigar smoke, a dark, heavy scent that grounded the nervous static in my head. "You missed a discrepancy in the Cayman file," he said softly, staring out the window into the black night. I froze, the glass halfway to my mouth. I double-checked the routing numbers. The 62,000 was the only anomaly. "I didn't say there was a financial error," he replied, turning his head to look at me. The kitchen lighting was dim, casting harsh shadows across the sharp angles of his face. "I said you missed a discrepancy. You implied Dante stole the money. He didn't." I lowered the glass to the marble counter, my mouth dry. "Then who did?" "I did," Gabriel said. "I funneled it to a private account. It was a test, to see if Dante was tracking my blind spots." I stared at him, trying to process the layers of manipulation. "You let me accuse him. You let me put a target on my own back, knowing he was innocent." "I needed to see if you had teeth," Gabriel countered, stepping closer. The air between us immediately compressed, growing dense and suffocating. "I needed to know if you were just a victim who knew how to hide, or if you knew how to bite back. You bit. You used me." My voice trembled, not with fear, but with a sudden, violently hot surge of anger. "I am not one of your soldiers, Gabriel. I'm not a piece on your chessboard. Aren't you?" He took another step. He was entirely in my space now. I had to tilt my head back to maintain eye contact. The heat radiating from his body was palpable, cutting through the chill of the kitchen. "You sat at my table. You wore my colors. You ruined a man's reputation with a single sentence. You're on the board, Ethan. You put yourself there. Because it was the only way to survive." I snapped, my hands balling into fists at my sides. "There's always a choice," he murmured, his gaze dropping to my mouth, then slowly dragging back up to my eyes. It wasn't a gentle look. It was possessive, heavy. "You could have stayed quiet. But you liked it. I watched you take a sip of that wine after you gutted him. You enjoyed the power." "I hate it." I lied, the words tasting like ash. Gabriel reached out. I braced myself, expecting pain, but his large hand simply cupped the side of my neck. His thumb brushed against my jawline. His skin was rough, calloused from years of gripping weapons and breaking bones, but his touch was excruciatingly deliberate. "You are a terrible liar," he whispered, his voice vibrating against my skin. I couldn't breathe. My lungs forgot how to expand. The scent of him, smoke, alcohol, danger, was intoxicating. I should have pushed him away. I should have run back to my sterile room and locked the door. But the anger and the adrenaline and the sheer, exhausting relief of being seen, not as a victim, not as collateral, but as something dangerous, snapped the last remaining wire in my brain. I grabbed the front of his shirt and pulled him down. The kiss wasn't a romance novel. It was a collision. Teeth, friction, desperate bruising pressure. Gabriel groaned, a low, guttural sound that vibrated straight into my chest. His arms wrapped around me, one hand tangling in my hair, pulling my head back to deepen the angle, while his other arm banded around my waist, lifting me entirely off the cold floor. I tasted scotch and aggression. I kissed him back with all the rage and terror I had swallowed over the last 3 years. My hands found the warm, corded muscle of his shoulders, gripping him tightly, anchoring myself in the center of the storm. He backed me up against the kitchen counter, the marble biting into my lower back. The impact jarred him, and he winced sharply, tearing his mouth away from mine. He rested his forehead against my shoulder, his chest heaving, his breath hot against my collarbone. "Your stitches," I gasped out, my hands immediately dropping from his shoulders to hover over his ribs. Screw the stitches, he gritted out, his voice thick and ragged. He didn't pull away. He just stood there holding me against him, his face buried in the curve of my neck. I let my hands settle on his back, feeling the heavy, uneven thud of his heart. My own pulse was deafening. We stayed like that for a long time, the rain washing the windows, the silence in the kitchen heavy with the absolute certainty that we had crossed a line. I wasn't just his bookkeeper anymore. I wasn't his collateral. I was his accomplice. And as I held the monster in the dark, feeling his blood and his breath against my skin, I realized the most terrifying truth of all. I didn't want to be anywhere else. Chapter 8. The Siege. Sunlight felt like a physical assault the morning after I kissed a murderer. I woke up in my own bed, my lips bruised and my lower back aching from the sharp edge of the marble counter. Gabriel was already gone. When I had retreated to my room hours earlier, leaving behind only the ghost of his scotch on my tongue and a profound, terrifying shift in my reality. I stood under the shower spray until the water ran lukewarm, scrubbing my skin as if I could wash away the complicity. It didn't work. When I looked in the fogged mirror, I didn't see the terrified Omega from the alley. I saw a man who had tasted power and swallowed it whole. The illusion of a quiet morning shattered at exactly 9:14 a.m. It didn't start with an explosion or a dramatic yell. It started with a subtle, sickening drop in air pressure, followed immediately by the heavy thud crack of the reinforced front doors buckling under a kinetic ram. My brain didn't process the sound as violence. It processed it as a construction accident. I was pulling a gray cashmere sweater over my head when the house alarm finally tripped. Not a shrill siren, but a low, bone-rattling electronic pulse designed to disorient intruders. Then came the gunfire. It wasn't cinematic. There was no rhythmic beat to it. It was a chaotic, deafening clatter that sounded like a mechanic dragging a steel pipe across a corrugated roof. A blast exploded in the hallway outside my room. A framed photograph of the coastline disintegrated into a cloud of glass dust and shredded paper. Panic, I discovered, has a distinct taste. It tastes like battery acid at the back of my throat. My knees immediately gave out, dropping me heavily onto the hardwood floor. My hands shook so violently I couldn't grip the edge of the bed to pull myself up. Ethan! The roar of my name cut through the mechanical screaming of the alarm. Footsteps pounded down the hall, heavy and frantic. My bedroom door didn't just open. It flew off its hinges, the wood splintering inward. Gabriel filled the frame. He had a matte black rifle in his hands, his knuckles bone white. He wasn't wearing a suit today. He was in dark jeans and a tactical vest strapped over a black Henley, and he looked entirely terrifying. There was a smear of wet crimson across his left cheekbone. "Get up," he barked, his voice devoid of the dark warmth from the kitchen. This was the cartel boss. This was the monster. I scrambled to my feet, my socks slipping on the polished wood. "What is happening?" "Dante," Gabriel said, grabbing my forearm and yanking me into the hallway. The grip was brutal, leaving no room for argument. He sold the gate frequency to the Russian syndicate on the north side. They bypassed the perimeter. We have 4 minutes before they breach the inner security doors. The hallway was filled with a thick, acrid gray smoke that smelled of ozone and burnt sulfur. My lungs burned with the first breath. I coughed, my eyes watering blindly. "Where is Leo?" I choked out, stumbling as Gabriel dragged me toward the east wing, the wing I had been explicitly told never to enter. "Holding the foyer," Gabriel grunted, raising his rifle as we rounded a corner. He fired 3 deafening bursts down the stairwell. I didn't look to see what he was shooting at. I squeezed my eyes shut and kept my feet moving. We reached a heavy steel door at the end of the corridor. Gabriel slammed his palm against a biometric scanner. The light flashed red, access denied. Gabriel cursed, a visceral, ugly sound. He hit it again, red. Dante wiped the local network. Gabriel growled, dropping the rifle to let it hang on its sling. He pulled a heavy sidearm from his hip. He's locking us out of the bunker. He's executing a hostile takeover of the digital infrastructure while his new friends slaughter my men. My terror suddenly crystallized into something entirely different. I wasn't a soldier. I didn't know how to shoot, but I knew how Dante's mind worked. I had spent a week inside his ledgers. Dante wasn't a tactical genius. He was a parasite who relied on automation. Gabriel, I gasped, grabbing his tactical vest. The server room. Where is the physical hardware? He looked down at me, his slate eyes wide and feral. Basement level. Why? Because Dante is an idiot who routes his secondary overrides through the main accounting terminal. I said, my voice shockingly steady. If we get to the servers, I can physically bypass the biometric firewall using the back door I found in his offshore routing software. Gabriel stared at me for a fraction of a second. The sounds of boots on the stairs behind us were getting louder. Men were yelling in a language I didn't understand. If we go to the basement, we are cut off from the extraction point, Gabriel said flatly. If you can't open that bunker door from the terminal, we die down there. I looked at the blood on his face. I looked at the dark hallway. I remembered the rain in the alley, the feeling of being entirely powerless, waiting for someone else to decide my fate. I can open it, I said. Gabriel didn't hesitate. He grabbed my hand, his fingers lacing tightly through mine. Run. Chapter 9. The server room. The basement smelled of damp concrete and hot server racks. The hum of the massive cooling fans masked the sounds of the dying house above us. Gabriel shoved me into the glass-walled server room, immediately turning his back to me to cover the solitary steel door we had just come through. 2 minutes, Ethan, he said, his breathing ragged. He leaned heavily against the door frame, his left hand pressing instinctively against his ribs where his fresh stitches had undoubtedly torn. Blood was seeping through his dark shirt. They're sweeping the ground floor. They'll find the stairwell soon. I didn't answer. I dropped into the rolling chair in front of the main terminal. The screen was locked, displaying a generic corporate logo. My fingers hovered over the mechanical keyboard. They were covered in plaster dust and shaking slightly. But the moment I touched the keys, muscle memory took over. I bypassed the front-end login, pulling up the command prompt. Black screen, white text. A logical, bloodless battlefield. I typed frantically, punching in the strings of code I had used to audit the Cayman accounts. Dante had used the same encryption key for the security grid that he used for his slush funds. It was a classic mistake made by arrogant men. They reused passwords because they believed they were untouchable. They're on the stairs, Gabriel said, his voice terrifyingly calm. I heard the metallic clack of him ejecting a spent magazine and sliding a fresh one into his sidearm. I'm in the local network, I yelled back, staring at the cascading lines of data. Locating the biometric lock directory. Hurry. I found the directory. But as I opened the subfolder, another window popped up on my screen. It was an active transfer protocol. Dante wasn't just locking us out. He was emptying Gabriel's primary operational accounts. Millions of dollars were actively draining into a blind trust in Malta. He was stripping the empire down to the studs while we were trapped in the basement. Gabriel, I said, my voice dropping. He's draining the accounts. All of them. The payroll, the bribes, the shipping logistics. He's taking the liquidity. Gabriel didn't turn around. He kept his gun trained on the hallway. Let it go. Just open the bunker. I stared at the progress bar, 42% transferred. If Dante took the money, Gabriel's cartel would collapse. A boss without money couldn't pay his soldiers. He couldn't buy loyalty. Even if we survived the night, Gabriel would be a king ruling over ashes. The rival syndicates would tear him apart within a week. And if Gabriel fell, I fell. I would be a penniless widow of a dead mobster. I would be right back in the alley. No, I whispered. Nora, open the damn door. Gabriel shouted, as a spray of bullets shattered the plaster in the hall outside. "I'm opening it, but I'm doing something else first," I muttered. I opened a secondary terminal window. I didn't try to stop Dante's transfer. Stopping it would trigger his failsafes. Instead, I altered the destination. I pulled up the routing number for the dummy corporation I had set up 2 days ago, a completely untraceable shell company whose only signatory was a boy named Ethan. I highlighted Dante's Malta account. I deleted it. I pasted mine. Enter. The progress bar stuttered, turned green, and resumed. 65% transferred. 80%. There at the door. Gabriel fired twice. A heavy body hit the floor outside with a wet thud. I tabbed back to the security directory. I found the lock protocol for the bunker door at the end of the hall. I highlighted the locked status and typed, "Open." Enter. A massive, echoing mechanical groan vibrated through the concrete floor. The heavy vault door, 10 yards down the corridor, slowly swung inward. "It's open," I screamed, grabbing the external hard drive from the console and shoving it into my pocket. Gabriel grabbed my sweater, practically hurling me out of the server room and toward the vault. Gunfire erupted behind us, deafening in the enclosed space. Concrete chips exploded against my legs, stinging like angry wasps. We dove through the vault door. Gabriel hit the manual override button on the inside. The massive steel hinges shrieked as the door slammed shut, sealing with a pneumatic hiss that instantly cut off the noise of the outside world. We were plunged into absolute, pitch-black silence. I lay on the cold steel floor, gasping for air, my lungs burning. Next to me, Gabriel was breathing in harsh, wet wheezes. Emergency lights flickered on, bathing the concrete bunker in a sickly yellow glow. The room held cots, rations, a medical kit, and a communications terminal. I pushed myself up onto my elbows. Gabriel was slumped against the vault door, his head tipped back against the steel. The front of his shirt was soaked in blood. The exertion had torn his stitches completely open. "You're bleeding," I said, stating the obvious. I crawled toward him, reaching for the medical kit bolted to the wall. "Leave it," he rasped, catching my wrist. His grip was weak, trembling slightly. "It's just blood. We're secure. The walls are 2 feet of reinforced concrete. They can't get in." He opened his eyes, looking at me. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind a stark, naked exhaustion. But beneath the fatigue, there was a heavy, dark awe. "You got the door open." "I did more than that," I said, pulling my wrist free. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the encrypted hard drive, setting it on the floor between us. Dante tried to take the operational funds. I hijacked the transfer. Gabriel's brow furrowed. "You stopped him?" "No. I let him initiate the drain, so the bank wouldn't flag the sudden movement. But I changed the destination." I looked down at my hands. They were covered in concrete dust and his blood. "The money is in an account only I control. $68 million. Silence stretched in the yellow light. The hum of the bunker's air filtration system, the only sound. Gabriel stared at me. He didn't look angry, didn't look betrayed. He looked like a man who had just watched a storm tear the roof off his house and found he admired the lightning. "You stole my entire empire," he stated softly, with a few keystrokes. "I secured your empire," I corrected him, meeting his slate eyes without flinching. "Dante thought you were weak because you bled. He thought I was weak because I was bought. He was wrong on both counts." Gabriel let out a low, rough laugh that turned into a grimace of pain. He reached out, his bloody hand cupping the back of my neck, pulling me forward until our foreheads rested against each other. "You could have routed it to yourself and left me to die in that hallway," he murmured, his breath ghosting over my lips. "With that kind of money, you could have vanished. No one would ever find you. Why didn't you run, Ethan?" I closed my eyes, leaning into the rough, calloused warmth of his hand. The truth was ugly, beautiful, and deeply contradictory. I had traded a suburban hell for a cartel war zone. And yet, sitting in a concrete box smelling of copper and cordite, I felt entirely rooted. Because, I whispered, opening my eyes to look into his, running is for prey. And I am tired of being prey. Gabriel's thumb traced the line of my jaw. You aren't prey, Ethan. You're the apex. He kissed me, tasting of dust and metallic adrenaline. It wasn't a kiss of possession, it was a coronation. In the damp yellow light of the panic room, with the monsters scratching at the reinforced steel doors above us, I realized I hadn't just survived the devil. I had become his equal. Chapter 10, The Reckoning. It took 3 months for the blood to fully wash out of the estate's hardwood floors. The retaliation had been swift, quiet, and absolute. Gabriel didn't wage a loud war on the streets. He used the digital footprint I ripped from Dante's servers to systematically dismantle the Russian syndicate's supply chains, freeze their assets, and leak their shipping routes to the DEA. Without money and product, their soldiers abandoned them. Dante was found a week after the attack, locked inside a shipping container at the docks. I didn't ask Gabriel how long Dante had been alive inside the box. I didn't want to know. And the terrifying truth was, I didn't care. Autumn had arrived, turning the coastal air brittle and cold. I stood on the catwalk of a massive, heavily guarded warehouse overlooking the bay. Below me, men were moving crates of untaxed electronics and God knows what else onto freight trucks. The logistics were flawless. I had spent the last 8 weeks optimizing the routes, stripping out the inefficiencies Dante had ignored. I was wearing a tailored charcoal suit that fit like a second skin. My hair was pulled back into a severe knot. I didn't look like the Omega in the oversized sweater anymore. I didn't feel like him either. Heavy footsteps echoed on the metal grating of the stairs. Gabriel walked up to the catwalk, handing me a paper cup of black coffee. He moved with a slight stiffness on his left side, a permanent reminder of the blade. But his presence was as overwhelming as ever. The offshore accounts cleared, Gabriel said, leaning against the railing beside me. He didn't ask for the passwords. He never had. He trusted me with the lifeblood of his organization because he knew I was the one keeping its heart beating. Good. The shell companies are fully insulated now, I replied, taking a sip of the bitter coffee. We are liquid, untraceable, and 20% more profitable than last quarter. He looked at me, a faint, dark smile playing on his lips. You're a terrifying Omega, Ethan. I learned from a terrifying Alpha, I countered smoothly. A heavy metal door at the far end of the warehouse rolled open with a screech. A black SUV drove inside, flanked by 2 armed guards. It parked near the base of the catwalk stairs. A new enforcer, a hulking man named Hayes who had replaced the casualty of the raid, stepped out of the driver's side. He opened the rear doors and hauled 2 figures out onto the concrete floor. My stomach gave a phantom lurch, an old reflex I couldn't completely suppress. Derek and Cole. They looked terrible. The veneer of cheap suburban luxury was entirely gone. Derek's dyed hair was a rat's nest, his roots gray and greasy. He was wearing a stained tracksuit. Cole looked thin, his designer clothes replaced by faded jeans and an oversized hoodie. They were both shaking violently in the cold warehouse air. Boss, Hayes called up to the catwalk, found these 2 trying to secure a loan from the Maroney family down south. They dropped your name as collateral, said they were family. Gabriel didn't say a word. He just took a step back, folding his arms across his chest, yielding the floor to me. I handed him my coffee and walked slowly down the metal stairs. Each step rang out like a gavel striking wood. Derek looked up. His eyes went wide, filling with a frantic, desperate relief. Ethan, he shrieked, his voice cracking. He tried to run toward me, but Hayes grabbed him by the collar, jerking him back. Oh, thank God. Ethan, sweetie, you have to help us. I stopped at the bottom of the stairs, keeping 10 feet of distance between us. I looked at the man who had made my life a living hell. I expected to feel rage, to feel the urge to scream, to hit him, to inflict the pain he had inflicted on me. But as I looked at him, trembling and pathetic, I felt absolutely nothing. The void was colder than ice. "You owe the Maronis money," I stated. It wasn't a question. "Just a little bit," Derek babbled, tears streaking his face. 80,000. It was a bad run at the tables, you know how it is. But you can pay it, right? Look at you. You're doing so well. Tell Mr. Costa to pay them off. We're family." Cole wouldn't even look at me. He kept his eyes glued to the concrete floor, his jaw trembling. "You sold me to Gabriel for 50,000, I said, my voice barely above a whisper, yet it carried clearly through the cavernous warehouse. "You depreciated my value to cover your own failures. We did what we had to do to survive." Derek sobbed, falling to his knees. "Please, Ethan, the Maronis, they said they'll break Cole's legs. You can't let them do that. You were always such a good, helpful boy." The audacity of his manipulation was almost impressive. He was trying to pull the strings of a puppet that no longer existed. I looked up at the catwalk. Gabriel was watching me, his expression unreadable. He wasn't going to intervene. This was my ledger to balance. I looked back down at Derek. "I was a good boy," I agreed softly. "But good boys don't survive the dark, Derek. You taught me that." I turned to Hayes. "What is the standard penalty for dropping cartel names without authorization?" Hayes didn't blink. "Usually we take a hand. But since they're civilian debt risks, we just hand them over to their creditors with a message that they have no backing from us." Derek screamed, a raw, animalistic sound of terror. "No. Ethan, you bitch, you owe me. I kept a roof over your head. I fed you." I walked over to him. Hayes tightened his grip, keeping him pinned. I leaned down until I could smell the stale alcohol and fear on his breath. "You kept me as a slave," I whispered, my voice dripping with absolute venom. "And then you sold me to a monster. But you made a fatal miscalculation. Derek, you assumed the monster was going to break me." I straightened up, smoothing the front of my jacket. "I'm not a charity, and I don't pay off bad debts. Hand them over to the Maronis." "Yes, sir," Hayes said. He dragged us screaming, thrashing Derek toward the SUV. Cole followed numbly, crying silently. I didn't watch them drive away. I turned my back and walked up the metal stairs. The heavy, dark satisfaction sitting in my chest was imperfect, brutal, and utterly liberating. When I reached the top of the catwalk, Gabriel handed my coffee back. He didn't offer a platitude, didn't ask if I was okay. He knew I was. "The shipment clears customs at midnight," I told him, looking out over the warehouse floor. Gabriel stepped close behind me, his chest pressing against my back, his arm wrapping around my waist, pulling me securely against him. I leaned my head back onto his shoulder, breathing in the scent of his cologne and the cold warehouse air. "Let them clear," Gabriel murmured, pressing a kiss to the side of my neck. "The Empire runs on your schedule now, boss." I closed my eyes. The Omega shivering in the wet alley was dead. In his place stood the architect of the underworld, held in the arms of the devil himself. And the terrifying truth was, the dark had never felt more like home. That night, the estate was quiet. The storm had finally passed, leaving the windows streaked with salt and the air smelling of wet earth. I sat in Gabriel's office, our office now, reviewing the final transfer logs. 68 million, fully laundered, fully untraceable. The Empire didn't just survive, it thrived. Gabriel appeared in the doorway, a glass of scotch in each hand. He set one on the desk beside me, his fingers brushing mine with deliberate slowness. "You've been staring at that screen for 3 hours. I like knowing exactly where every dollar is," I replied, taking the glass. "Old habits." He leaned over, his chest pressing against my back, his lips grazing my ear. "You run this organization better than I ever did. The men respect you." The numbers obey you. His hand found my waist, warm and possessive. What's left for me to do? I tilted my head back, meeting his dark, approving gaze. Keep me company. That's an order. He laughed, low, rough, genuine. Yes, boss. And for the first time, I believed that the man who bought me in a rain-soaked alley had given me something Derek never could, a place where I belonged. Not as property, not as prey, as the one who held the crown. The dark was mine now, and I had no intention of letting it go.